So again, the More Life element was we were growing, and as a programme, we became a bit cumbersome in the university. So the university's goal is to train students and do research. And we were sort of providing services to the NHS, we're providing services to local government and providing services to people. And so our sort of overarching goals and activities were aligned, but not completely aligned. So the university decided to set up a separate company, which is MoreLife. MoreLife's owned by the university, and therefore that allows us to get on with working with the NHS, working with local government. Probably what I'm assuming a lot of your partners and all of your stakeholders do in working with local authorities and different agencies on the ground. That's what MoreLife does. Luckily, we have the university as a parent company that we can work on research and research bids, and we can train students, and we can partner with students and student placements and PhDs. So there's a real good relationship there that allows us to grow as two separate organisations in an aligned way.
Hi, and welcome to another episode of the Drive Phase podcast from Coordinate Sports. This is your show about sports founders, leaders and experts and the stories behind their business journeys. Just wrapped up a conversation with Paul Gately, who is the Professor of Exercise and Obesity at Leeds Beckett University, as well as leading other organisations such as MoreLife and Obesity UK. A great conversation with Paul, catching up. I've known him a long while, and generally a topic close to my heart, and I guess most of our listeners. We talked candidly and kind of wide-rangingly about childhood obesity, the root causes, what can be done, who's doing great work out there, and also a little bit about Paul's journey into this field, and obviously a field that he's really passionate about and spending 20 years plus on it. For all of the listeners who are working with children on a day-to-day basis, it's a great listen to just try and understand a little bit more widely around the causes and maybe what you could do to just help prevent that a little bit. We also talk about policy and funding, inevitably, around what is actually required to kind of meet the challenge. Yeah, great catch-up. Love the conversation. Hopefully you will too. So enjoy the show, subscribe, like. We want to hear the comments as well. So if you do have anything that you think we should have touched on, please add those in the comments and we'll follow up with Paul and hopefully get him on again. Okay, I'm delighted to be joined today by Paul Gately. He is Professor of Exercise and Obesity at Leeds Beckett University and also the interim CEO of Obesity UK and I believe CEO and co-founder of MoreLife. Obesity UK are actually a charity designed to represent, educate and provide support to more than 20,000 members across the UK. So much to talk about, Paul, but welcome to the show. Good to catch up again.
Yeah, thanks, James. Great to see you again. Great to see the great work you're doing.
Yeah, appreciate that. I mean, for those who don't know you, I guess they probably do know your work or working in the same field, but what we tend to do to let our listeners get to know you a little bit better, go back to generally starting at kind of school life. And because what we're going to be talking about in terms of like that physical activity, weight management, all those type of things for children nowadays, if we go back to when you were kind of in school and coming up, what was the landscape like then, and how did you find school?
So I think I was really lucky because at the time I was at school, which was a long time ago, James, well before you, and at that sort of time then, school sport was really important. You know, even from primary school, it was a big element to school life. And I was a sporty kid. I wasn't particularly academic, and so any opportunity to be sporty, I took them. I played cricket at my school. It was a big thing, but I was rubbish at cricket and wanted to play rounders with the girls more than I wanted to play cricket with the lads. And then I basically tried football, really enjoyed football, and I played football for a while. But I also started off running, and I was a sort of middle distance runner. And I did okay when I was sort of 11. Then moved to secondary school, carried on football, basketball, volleyball, any opportunity to do any sport, I followed it. I was sort of an okay academic student. But then I got involved in running and ran as a middle distance runner, was on a sort of national squad. So my introduction to sport was ideal in a way. I was really lucky. I got on well with PE teachers, got on well with local clubs, and was very lucky to follow, the pathway that I think many sports people, certainly better than me, but many sports people get the opportunity to do. And so for me, I've been really lucky at my introduction to sport as part of my early life.
Yeah, and I guess growing up, it was Manchester, wasn't it, or Northwest you grew up, right? So
yeah, Manchester, yeah.
It seems like, and normally for most people, when you've got that little bit of talent as well as enjoy sport, being a sporty kid, you kind of get noticed, maybe get pushed along a little bit more as well. So you don't kind of slip through the tracks like a lot of kids do. Now, you like semi-sporty or ones who don't really enjoy it from a physical activity side. I'm always curious on this one. What was the kind of visually, if we were going to look at the class back then versus a class now, in terms of what they look like? So remember, we're going to talk about weight management, but there wasn't many. I remember when I was going, there wasn't many kids who were potentially would be classed as overweight, or maybe struggling with that at that early age, primary school age.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, we are talking nearly 40 years since I was in primary school and 30 years since I was in secondary school. So, when we look at obesity rates then, they were much lower than what they were now. And effectively, what would be classed as a child that was suffering with a weight problem, you would say there was a handful of these young people in the school when I was at school. Whereas now you are looking at least 1 in 3 of children in every class that suffer from a weight problem. So there's been a huge shift in that period of time. And that's, I guess what's interesting is, for me, and I'm really interested in what's the dimension of the school sport element to that, because, I was lucky. I think at the moment, school sport is not high on the agenda. And therefore I can see the problem getting worse, even though 1 in 3 of our kids still have a weight problem.
Yeah, I'd probably getting right into the meat of the conversation now, I think, because in that one, it's difficult to say in terms of we do have the focus, and obviously we all work in that sector in terms of really, really passionate about school sport, wanting there to be more of it, having talking about funding into it. But then we have at the same time, the rates of obesity are rising. Do you think it's just almost like a culture change from, we're talking about sport and stuff, but I don't know if you ever really, if there was ever really like a true focus on school sport as a separate thing. It's almost just like part of your school day, right, in terms of that activity? I
think as I've observed the last sort of 30, 40 years, both from a child's perspective, but more as an adult and then as a sort of someone engaged in this process. And, and the exercise and obesity gives me a slant toward the physical activity exercise side of this. And obviously my sport background gives me a passion. I did a degree in sports science. So, I am leaning toward that. So any of your listeners that are that sort of sports background, then we're all on the same page. And I think what I've observed is, when I was a kid, there was some investment in that area. Then we saw, in the 90s, less investment in that area. Then I think in the 2000s with school sport and school sport premium and a whole range of other things came into play, school sport colleges, and the P in school sports strategy, and these sports leaders that were working in primary schools. And there was a real investment around 2000, sort of 2008, 2010. And then I think since the crash of 2008, we've seen a gradual decline in investment in school sport. And that, is a real issue. What you're absolutely right. What we've seen in that period of time is consistently increasing trends in obesity. So you then might say, well, what's the cause of that? And I think that, school sport is not the only cause. And I think both you and I, James, and maybe many of your listeners might reflect on is what was available in school sport during the sort of 90s and 2000s was probably more towards the sportier kids and probably less towards the less sporty kids. And so there's been a question mark over the degree to which school sport in the 90s and in the 2000s, whilst I would be very positive about that period of time, one could argue, and I think this is not an unreasonable argument, that it probably widened health inequalities. So the sportier kids got more sport on offer and those less sporty kids got less. And I think whilst there's been talk of trying to change that, there's not been real investment. I think there's a lot of really passionate people that benefited from school sport in the sort of, the 90s and 2000s. And I engage a lot with the Association of Physical Education, and there's some fantastic, PE leaders in that space who also would argue there's been, there's a lot more they can do. But fundamentally, the political will for the last 15 years at least has not been there. The economy, austerity has meant that our investment in the value added that PE and school sport can provide has not been there. And I think many of us who are trying to help children, young people and families in that space have not been able to. And the outcome is, as well as obesity rates going up, what I think we're seeing is a skyrocketing of obesity rates. Government agendas have been to try and level it off, and actually it's not leveling off, it's going up significantly, such that since 2016, we've seen a rise of nearly 800,000 children suffering from obesity.
What we want to do is circle back to this, and I know we've talked about that. What are the reasons? What are the real causes, the root causes for this? I just wanted to just finishing off your journey a little bit. I know you mentioned there sport in school, sport in secondary school. Touched on you went to do the classic kind of sports science degree at university. What got you into like the full academics? Obviously, professor now and leading on the exercise and obesity at Leeds Beckett. But yeah, what was that journey like?
Well, I had an unusual journey actually, because I was a pretty reasonable athlete, but when I was sort of 17, I came ill due to overtraining, and I didn't really have the right leadership around my coaching. I had a great coach, but they didn't look at me holistically. So I was off doing double the amount of training that I should have been, overtrained, became unwell, and needed to take a break. And I travelled to Camp America. I thought I'll go and do a summer in America, keep away from the running, try and rest and recuperate.
Was that almost like a glandular fever type thing? Just a big breakdown of everything?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, I know a few people.
My body just said, we've had enough, you need to start resting. And it told me in no uncertain terms. So I went to work on Camp America, and I'd signed up to go to a sports camp. I was sporty, it was in my blood, everything about it. Anyway, I was about a mile away from this camp, and this guy said to me, you do realise you're going to a weight loss camp for kids, don't you? And I thought, oh my God. And, at the time I weighed about 9 stone, and I walked into a room of staff, and most of those staff weighed in the 20 stones, and one staff member who weighed 45 stone. And then the kids arrived, and they were all range of sizes, with one child that weighed 42 stone at 14 years old. So it was just, and I'd spent my life with skinny athletes. So I was now in a completely
culture shock, right?
Yeah, completely alien environment to me. But I guess what was really valuable about that experience, two things was, I was never super talented. I used to be around people who were super talented, and I've come across some really super talented athletes. I was never quite super talented. So I had to work at it. And when I realized applying that work ethic, that sort of slow progression to the children and people I was working with, I found that we could achieve the same results. They were starting off at a lower level of fitness, but applying that really robust, supportive coaching, engaging young people, I found was actually quite successful at what I did. And I got fascinated by the subject of obesity. So I was at university, so I'd spend my summers in America at the weight loss camp, and then I spend the rest of my year doing more research as my undergrad, and then I did my postgrad, my PhD, and I was trying to learn about this area. And in 99, I got an academic post at the university, and then I carried on this sort of pathway of a professor towards service provision. And that, I guess, was the journey from school to an academic and a sort of career in this area.
I don't know whether this is exactly the timeline when we first met. I think at the time, probably like 2010, maybe 2009-ish. Remember we did something with, it was ITV, I think, at the time, and that was around the camps. I think it was around the camps that you had at Leeds Beckett. Was that something that you developed as part of the kind of academia, or was it like partnership with public health, referrals? I'm not sure, because I know obviously it was a commercial operation, I think, but with getting referrals in and getting some great results there.
Yeah, it's a great question. And I guess it takes me back to that journey, because what in the American camp, what was really, I was spending my summer working at the camp, and then I was spending the rest of the year as an academic. And it just, there was a real disconnect for me that on the camp, it was a very extreme regimen of everybody was starved. I mean, the kids, irrespective of weight, and, when you've got a child who weighs 42 stone, 800 calories a day is not a lot of food. And it's complete starvation. So And as I was reading the literature, I was realizing that this wasn't right. And body would move into starvation mode and lean tissue loss and all these negative impacts of extreme diet. What I also realized was that there was a very much a boot camp mentality around exercise. There was, it was almost as if, the staff screaming at the kids was the best way to get the best out of them.
Well, that was it. That's how you saw it from the outside. Is like the fat camp, wasn't it? That was the kind of how it was always pushed and marketed. Yeah.
Exactly. And I observed this and I'm thinking this is completely different to what my experience of sport, school sport, club sport had been. And actually this nurturing, supportive environment that I'd existed in, I felt actually if we apply that to this US model, so that was what my PhD was on, taking the US model and taking the evidence base and taking what I'd learned from sport, what I was learning from nutrition, what I was learning from science, and trying to sort of, if you like, super science it up. And that's what my PhD was on, translating that model from this sort of classic American boot camp to a model that was much more scientifically led. And then that was when I got my job at the university. And in 99, we set up our first UK camp. That was you're absolutely right. And we'd looked for a year for research funding. Obesity was a major challenge for children, but there was almost no research funding whatsoever. So the best way to do it was to set up a commercial operation at the university, which is what we did. And it was a challenging time, but obesity was high on the agenda. And so we had families turn up, we had families paid. Then the NHS got interested, local authorities got interested and started to invest in these children. And then we started to do the research alongside it. So that was really the early part of the 2000s. Our residential program was very dominant because the evidence was showing it really worked. The challenge was it was expensive. It was really expensive. And I used to always reflect, as an athlete, I would have a coach looking after me 3 or 4 days a week. I'd be doing my training 3 or 4 days a week. We'd go away to training camps on a regular basis. I was part of a national squad that had 3 or 4 training camps a year. So there was a lot invested in me, and I was not paying a lot of money as a child from a sort of an area in Manchester that wasn't much money around. So and I sort of reflect on the fact that we did invest a lot in children and young people in sport, but what we didn't do was we've not, and we still don't invest a lot of children and young people who suffer from obesity. And that's obviously what I'm trying to challenge. And it's how do we work together as sort of teams of exercise, physical activity leaders and nutrition and diet experts and psychologists and social workers to really get the best for our kids.
I think that's always the challenge as well in terms of like that, showcasing that return on investment, because I always think the same thing. If you're proactive, there's probably no better place to place the funding than now with the kids versus you'll know better than I will in terms of the cost of treating obesity in adults or in one individual versus what it costs to fund or to subsidise junior programs or children's programs.
I think I look at this in, I guess, 2 ways. I think in a sense there was not evidence to say that our Olympic legacy would be very strong. And we spent a lot of money on the Olympics. There was no evidence to say it was strong, and yet the politicians spent a lot of money on the Olympics. And it was a fantastic Olympics. The London 2012, it was incredible. And, we should all I'm still really proud of our country for doing that and delivering on it. But it didn't need science or evidence what it needed was politicians to get behind that investment. I think we saw an investment in school sport in the late 90s and early 2000s, and we did have political will. Sue Campbell, who was a sort of leader at that time in this space, was really at the top table, and she really drove an agenda of school sport that I think there's a real positive legacy from. But then that stopped. A new government came in, different ideas, different plans, and I'm not trying to make this political, but politics matters. And so the politics of shifting from a mindset of sport to a mindset of physical activity to a mindset of obesity is something that I think we're still on the journey of. And in a sense, a politician standing next to an Olympian is probably more powerful than a politician stood next to a child who, you or colleagues might have made more physical active, or I might have helped lose some weight.
I'm curious in terms of the camps now, I guess like distance travel and what you're doing around that space. I'm assuming they're in like maybe a different guise now, but what's happened to that program that was at the university to now? How's that developed? Is it different? And is that kind of what you're doing with MoreLife? What's the link there?
Yeah, so again, the MoreLife element was we were growing. And as a program, we became a bit cumbersome in the university. So the university's goal is to train students and do research. And we were sort of providing services to the NHS, we're providing services to local government and providing services to people. And so our sort of overarching goals and activities were aligned, but not completely aligned. So the university decided to set up a separate company, which is MoreLife. MoreLife's owned by the university. And therefore, that allows us to get on with working with the NHS, working with local government. Probably what I'm assuming a lot of your partners and all of your stakeholders do in working with local authorities and different agencies on the ground. That's what MoreLife does. Luckily, we have the university as a parent company that we can work on research and research bids, and we can train students and we can partner with students and student placements and PhDs. So there's a real good relationship there that allows us to grow as two separate organisations in an aligned way. But I sense, we had to spin out of the university in order for us to be able to sort of engage more effectively with the NHS and local government organisations. And that's where we find ourselves now. So the camp model stopped actually in 2008. And the reason it stopped was because funding was stopping. The austerity was biting the public health budgets. And when you look at the price per child, despite the evidence was really clear, we had tons of evidence showing that the programs were effective. Kids lost weight, they kept the weight off, and it had massive impacts on mental health, physical health, emotional health, education. Money was pulled because in a squeezing budget, you look at, should we really be spending that much on one child, whereas we can spend that same amount on many more children. And that's local government decision making. And that's not my decision to make. I think it's regrettable that the children that are most in need are not getting the care and support that they do need. So what we've done is we've translated. So we work with schools, we deliver programs in schools, we work with local authorities, and then we deliver community programs at two levels. One, working, after school clubs, weekend programs, very light touch, diet, physical activity, a bit of psychology, a bit of social support. And then we have another level, which is very specialist, where we have doctors, psychologists, dietitians working with children and families that have got severe obesity. And really the only option is medicalised.
Slightly interventions time. Right. Okay. Yeah. Right.
Yeah. Exactly. So medicalised support, not in a residential setting, but still in a much more formalised sort of intervention setting than a sort of community setting. And they tend to be run through sort of our partnerships with NHS partners as well. So really that sort of high-end specialist support for children over a longer period of 1 to 2 years is when we might be working with those children, because that's the sort of care and support that they need.
I guess geographically, is that all over the country? And obviously before predominantly Yorkshire, wasn't it? But are you all over the country now?
Yeah, we're sort of we've got some great programs running in London, fantastic program running in Hounslow, and then as far East London, over in Barking and Dagenham. We're in Kent and Suffolk and Essex, and then up north in Manchester and Leeds and other areas as well. Yeah, I mean we're busy. We're busy. Yeah, all over.
Just circling back to that chat we had, the topic we were talking about, that kind of root cause stuff. So there's a stat, and it came out. You'd be all over this, but I remember hearing it maybe a couple of months ago, and it kind of stuck with me. It was one of those that kind of jars you a little bit, and it was 50% of the world's population is going to be obese. I think it was by 2030 or 2035. I'm not sure. Maybe 10 years time. This is the kind of the headline, and then you underneath that's the trends everywhere. What do we feel like is the cause of that? Is it purely school sport? And because when we're looking at globally, that stat was talking about. Is it just that we're maybe not as active as we were or in school? Like, what's the biggest driver to that? So
simply, the biggest driver to obesity is food. That's without a shadow of a doubt. But what we've got to appreciate is the proportionate contribution of diet or exercise is also influenced by a variety of other factors. So, you and I had a great, our introductions into sport through sport and through our lives, sport has been a dominant factor. So you might argue that I ran my way out of a bad diet for most of my life. That's the way I could look at me. And so for me, and as you're saying for you, and maybe other listeners as well, that activity has been a dominant force in helping us keep our weight down.
You see that with football and stuff, don't you? Just like five-a-side or whatever. I play football because so then I can have some pints on the way or whatever. Do you know that kind of, I do this so then I can get away with doing that.
Yeah, and in a sense that's okay, and I think that's the thing. That's actually okay. What we've got to do is be realistic. We're thinking about people, and different people live different lives. So there's a group of people, but we know that the people like us or others, that in percentage of the population, we are less prominent than the rest of the population. Those sporty types are less common than everybody else. So in a sense, the contribution physical activity can make is less, because per unit calorie intake versus expended, you have to burn a lot of calories to burn off a pizza, basically. It's as simple as that. And so for the majority of the population, they're not that active on a day-by-day basis. They've not had the fortune or the interest, and both are okay, to be as active. And therefore, their dietary behaviours are much more influential. But then we need to think of a layer out of that. So, if you live, obesity rates, let's say during COVID, is really interesting. We saw a widening of health inequalities and obesity rates in those in more deprived communities living in more urban areas than those in less deprived rural. And so let's think about that. So those in more deprived communities living maybe in more concentrated, dense populations, weren't able to go out. They haven't got a back garden and go and kick around the football when we're all in the middle of COVID. You can remember the images of families in high rises in cities across the country that were effectively locked into their flat for a period of months. And so, of course, their physical activity levels are going to go down, and their ability to, go out and order, and because of price, order the right or buy the right amount of food, because price is a massive challenge to many families. The recommendations from Public Health England are not achievable in a large majority of families. So this is sort of disparity in what people can afford to eat in terms of a healthy diet. And so you've got these two influences. You've got diet and exercise, but they're influenced by wide factors. People that we work with might suffer from mental health challenges, and we can't just say, well, just get over it. I mean, these are suffering from serious depression or anxiety that stop them from going out and drive them to eat inappropriate diets or unhealthy diets. So you've got this sort of diet and exercise bit in the middle, but then you've got all these wider influences. And unless we consider the wider influences, we can't then really get to grips with how we solve the problem. So we know diet is more important than exercise, but not in everybody. But what we do know is the influences, what we call the wider determinants, are really, really critical. And if you don't have access to the positive wider determinants, your chances of obesity are much higher. And so I think that's the thing that we really need to think about, is how do we consider those wider determinants? How are we thinking about families in those more challenging and deprived communities? How are we thinking about families that when mum or dad or their carers go into the supermarket and thinking, right, I know I need to buy healthy fruits and vegetables here, but actually, what if those fruits and vegetables go off before my kids have eaten them, and I've spent money and I've wasted money, when I know if I buy a bag of crisps or a packet of crisps or a multi-pack of crisps, they will eat that and my money will get used and my children will get fed. That's not an easy decision to be making.
Yeah, it's a challenge as well in terms of the marketing side of things, because I always think that going to any supermarket and you just kind of, even if it's not, it looks like it's a better value, right? Because of the way it's presented, and all the offers are on the kind of the things you mentioned, stuff you shouldn't be really consuming if you can help it. And the veg is just kind of as it is normally, just it's there. So that, as well as trying to look and balance the budget domestically, has got to be tough.
And then if it go to the physical activity side of that, I know I've got 5 kids and they're in school, and what I can say really clearly is their access to physical education is less. And if it wasn't for me being proactive with their after-school sports, we see now more and more, and I speak to a lot of teachers that are saying to me the pressure on other subjects, and particularly in COVID catch-up, the pressure was not on, let's get kids more physically active. The pressure was on catch up in reading, writing, spelling, maths, and so on and so forth. And, that's for the education people to decide. But I would be saying, come on, let's take a longer term view of this, because our children's physical health is just as important as their academic health. And I guess that's the lower priority I've observed in the system in the last 10 years. And as a parent, it's something that really frustrates me, particularly when I think about access for children, young people who might not have, I've got available resources to take my kids to do sporty things. Other families may not have that. So when we start to look at the melting pot of wider determinants, you start to see why we're seeing these spiraling levels of obesity, and particularly why we're seeing them going up in certain areas. And just to finish that point, what we've known for at least a decade is, if you take a London borough around Richmond on the sort of leafy green suburbs of London, the rates of obesity have been pretty much levelling off for the last 10 years. Where if you take some of the more central, more dense populations, more deprived communities, their rates of obesity have been skyrocketing. You can't tell me that parenting's got better in Richmond and not in central London. It's those wider determinants are influencing those children's lives in central London.
At the moment, we do a lot of work with around disadvantaged children and with local authorities, and around holiday hunger and things like that. So it's really, when we're kind of looking at the two big challenges, we've got obesity rates rising, but then at the same time we've got the challenges like holiday hunger, where kids are going hungry at the same time. So it's got to be. I always look at that and think it's got to be something to do with the quality of the food. So when we are able to, in those disadvantaged communities, access food, what is it that they're able to access, and that's got to be something that's driving the obesity angle as well, right?
Yeah, you're totally right, James, and you're completely spot on. It's quality of access to food. That's what's critical. And as I was saying before, for many families who are making decisions about, do I buy the greens, or do I buy something else that I know my kids are going to eat? Do I experiment with food that my kids are going to turn the nose up at, or and take the risk of them not eating it, or do I feed them, or do they go hungry? And no, that's really, really difficult. And I think it only but highlights the sort of major challenges that we face. And I mean, we're doing a project at the moment, a big research project funded by the UK Research Innovation Fund, which is a sort of big government fund. And we're working with a variety of academic partners, and we're working with Sainsbury's, and they're doing some really interesting work. We're trying to understand the sort of views of people living with obesity and family living with obesity in their shopping habits. Why are they making the choices that they're making? Because if we can understand that, we can then work with the supermarkets to nudge different people with different ways, so they have access via their Nectar card to incentivize customers. And that's what we're starting to do. We're starting to look at ways that they can incentivize their customers to the more healthier options versus the less healthy options, because we understand the population. So I think there's lots that a lot of stakeholders are doing, and to me, what's critical is we work together. When I started this work in obesity, 20 odd years ago, the debate, I used to go to conferences, and there was always a debate about which is better, diet or exercise. Are the exercise people better than the diet people? Who's more important? And it's a no-win game. We're all important. All the work that you're doing and all you're doing with colleagues is fantastic. But so is what all the nutrition people are doing and the dietitians. And if we all think and work together, then actually we've got a fighting chance of helping children deal with obesity, be more physically active, and eat a healthy diet, which has got to be the goal for all of us.
Yeah, and I think I guess to add to it as well, that we're talking about the outside factors. I think so. We talk about kind of mental health and how people feel psychologically. I always think that like I said, the quality of the food, I think it does affect. So like if you eat poor quality food, or things with certain ingredients in, you almost kind of get that kind of cycle where you start getting into a bit of a depression, and you eat more of it, and then you don't feel like doing anything or going out the house, and you're in the house, and it's kind of cycling around. If I have a day or a weekend, I just don't do anything, you automatically feel like a little bit lazy, and don't feel like going out. If you let it, I'm assuming if you let it go for a couple of weeks, it'll get can get kind of really habitual kind of thing. So I think there's something to say around that side of things, well, like the psychological element.
Completely. And again, as I say, we're probably both fortunate that over our lives, we've had those cycles of those habits being established, and we go back to them as our default.
You can spot it, right? You're thinking, I need to get out and have a run. Yeah, exactly.
As you say, I'm feeling it. So that feeling is really important. It's actually quite a big motivator. But actually, if you've not had sport ingrained in your lifestyle, or eating healthy has not been ingrained for a variety of reasons, this is not about judgment. This is about, there's a variety of factors. So if you've not been encouraged in that way, or you've not been able to behave in that way, then of course what the routine is unhealthy, and so the default fallback is unhealthy. And I guess it's that balancing act. It's really hard for a lot of people, and the longer people live, the longer those behaviours are established for.
I wanted to ask you, I know you're across it and you'll know what's going on. It's kind of globally in terms of who's getting it right. If we look at other countries and maybe other policies that people have put in place, and I was going to ask you about what your thoughts on kind of sugar tax and what we're doing here. But who's getting it right? If you want to look to another country or another even an area of the country, who's really making progress? So,
the best example of getting it right is the Dutch and Amsterdam. So in around the 2000s, the UK was pretty good in between sort of mid 90s to sort of late 2000s. The UK was leading the way in a lot of work. So the work we were doing at MoreLife, there was an organisation called MEND at the time. All the school sports strategy was aligned. There was some really, really brilliant work going on. And it was well invested in, well joined up. Even all the Olympic sort of investment it was a real melting pot of big priority of health and wellness of our population was there. And I think we were doing it well. What then happened was the Dutch, and particularly a professor called Jaap Seidel, who I know very well, I really like. He'd done some fantastic work. He came over, interviewed all the best people in the UK and took all the knowledge back. And for the last 15 years, they've been implementing it. They used to have levels of obesity in the teens and are now in below the teens. So they were 18% and now down to 12%. But they are investing 200 million. They're investing equivalent of about 2 billion a year in obesity in Amsterdam. And if you sort of scale up to the UK, what we would need to invest to get the same outcomes, but we're starting at 30%. They were at 18%. Now, what did they do? They did two things. They did a lot of preventative work. They worked with supermarkets. They worked with companies. They didn't have a fight about you're a food provider, you're evil. They worked with them. They said, okay, what do we do collaboratively? And I remember initiatives like most of the soft drinks companies they work with reduced the portion sizes of the soft drinks in the supermarkets because they all agreed that it was the right thing to do. They came together, agreed a plan, and that's what they did. There was supermarket interventions, there was manufacturer interventions. So there was this preventative effort. Schools were involved, cooking, cycling was already a big thing, obviously, in Amsterdam, but it was increased even more for children and young people. They worked through the schools, but then they also worked with the health system, and children that were living with obesity were really well invested in. All the best knowledge from a number of us in the UK was taken over to Amsterdam. They implemented what we knew and have continued to implement with a large budget that was committed for over 30 years. They came in, they took all our best ideas and they implemented them and funded them. And no surprise, what we see in Amsterdam is a dramatic reduction in childhood obesity, even though their levels of childhood obesity were low.
I guess, is it essential then in order to make that type of change? Obviously, there's the commitment and the kind of getting a consensus, getting on around the table. I'm assuming that the funding, though, that level of funding is always essential. There's nothing you can do are we saying that unless we get the big money in, it's never going to change, or is there anything else we can do?
I guess when I look at it, you look at the Olympics, it was brilliant. Why was it brilliant? Why did we do so well? Because we'd have been invested in sport for 20 years. We'd had, I'll default to sport because I love sport and it's my background, but I think it's a great example. We invested in sport and we did well on the medal roster, and we continue to do well on the medal roster because we were investing 20, 30 years ago. And you look at some other countries that did similar, Sydney Olympics, Australia invested, but then de-invested, and their performance has not been as good as it was at the Olympics in Sydney in 2000. And I guess that legacy has lasted. That Olympic legacy in sport has been fantastic and lasted. So money counts. That doesn't mean to say that the sport governing bodies and the athletes and our school leaders and our school PE teachers weren't all part of that. We were all pushing in the same direction. And when the whole system pushed in the same direction, we had great outcomes, and we continue to get great outcomes now. The same's for obesity. That's what the Dutch have done. They've got around the table, they've been grown up, they've got the money, and then they've invested with a plan for 30 years, and away they go. But we do this thing as well. I mean, people will have a view about whether HS2 is a good idea or not, and it's not going to come online for another however many 10, 15, 20 years. But we've started investing now. We made a decision and we're going in that direction. It takes a decision, and it takes investment, and it takes action. And I think on the obesity front, and also I'd argue physical activity over the last sort of 15 years, we talk a good game, but there's not the investment and there's not the bringing together all the key stakeholders to align it in the right direction. And so our children are suffering.
Paul, I could talk to you about just getting into. I'm conscious of time if we get into this back and forth for a long time. I want to just switch gears a little bit and talk a little bit about yourself. And this is more just for we'll talk about, I guess, performance and personal performance, business performance, kind of staying in peak condition and kind of getting the most out of ourselves. Do you have any routines and things that you do on a day-to-day, I'm assuming you're still running or things like that you like your go-tos that I have to do this to keep myself in shape?
I guess there's two things. So I have a goal. So one thing for me is I love mountaineering. So I'm really lucky. One of my best friends is a mountaineer. He looks after me because I'm quite useless in the mountains. So basically, I go and I love being in the mountains. I was in the Alps in the summer. But I know that if I'm not looking after myself, that things become more dangerous in the mountains. And so, that focus is there. As I've got older, it used to be just fitness and running. But as I've got older, I've realised that if I don't do yoga, and I do yoga with Adrian every morning on YouTube, 20 minutes, and it's brilliant. It's really good. It's free. It's accessible. And then I do a sort of a weight session 2-3 times a week as well. And then I run usually every day or go out on my bike. So I've retained, I've retained my activity levels, but I've had to translate it because my joints don't last as long as they used to do, and my muscles feel more tired these days. So those supplementary activities of yoga and weights, and then being on my bike rather than being running, are just the ways I found for me enable me to do the thing that I love, which is being out in the mountains in the summer.
Yeah, it's a good way to think about it. That incentive to know that right, I need to be in shape because I've got my trip or my next hike or whatever it is you've got coming up. Last question, and it's just a reflection. We always ask everyone this question. It's just, if you were going to go back in time to the start of your career, maybe just as you're leaving university or whatever, and give yourself one piece of advice around career or business leadership, whatever it'd be, what would you go and tell yourself?
I mean, I was always challenging the system, and that's what I feel I've done throughout my career. But it'd be to challenge it even more, to really, be comfortable in that challenge rather than be sort of scared of that challenge. Maybe what I would probably tell myself is to maybe be a bit more diplomatic than I probably was when I was younger. But I think those two things go hand in hand. My diplomacy skills, some would say now, are still not good enough. But I guess learning to be diplomatic when I'm passionate about something is probably the lesson I could have benefited from the most. But I would still be more pushy, but more diplomatically pushy is the thing I'd say.
Nice. Paul, I appreciate your time and conversation so much. It's great to catch up, and hopefully we can do it again sometime.
Thanks, James. Really enjoyed that conversation.